Well, welcome back to Menders. Today we have Sarah Bettman. And Sarah, you're the founder and principal at Bettman Consulting Group. You're also a speaker and coach, and you focus on different topics that are specifically related to advancing women. And I am really thrilled and honored to have you sharing your expertise with me today.
I'm I was just gonna say excited to be here. We've only been talking about this for months.
I did want to share with folks where they can find you, and I always link this in the show notes too. But so that I don't forget, folks can find you at www.sarahbettman.com. All right. So, anyway, thank you so much again for being here.
You're most welcome. I'm really excited. The work you do is near and dear to my heart.
Well, appreciate that. So I invited you here to, I guess, talk about a couple of different things, really exploring leadership through the lens of, women in leadership, and also specifically thinking about how do we help executive level leaders to make values based decisions and allow those decisions to sort of permeate their organizations. So I'm excited to get into all that. But first of all, I'd just love to have you share a bit about yourself and what you do.
Sure, sure. So I am a consultant, coach, speaker, and I have Bettman Consulting Group, which focuses on early stage companies that are starting on their diversity, equity, inclusion journey. We focus really on the principles of culture. So defining mission, values, maybe redefining because it was a thing on the wall that isn't quite being lived. A lot of the organizations I'm working with have grown fast and find that those dynamics, the mission values, aren't quite fitting for the next generation of the workforce coming in. So that's a big part of what I do. And then advancing women leaders work. I've done this work around the globe, and I'm passionate about advancing women in their own lives to have agency and live what I'm calling stoked lives, and then also in their.
Thank you so much. And I would love to just hear a little bit more about what that means for you to work with these companies or organizations to think about their culture and to maybe modernize or update culture to better reflect those values of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and what we're caring more about today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's consistent in my clients is they want to do something but don't know where to start. And as senior leaders that tend to be of a generation that are boomers, the values of the next generations coming up are very different. And so these things that I grew up, uh, home and life, they don't meet. Those walls have gotten very thin, especially with COVID and everyone working from home. But even the values, going back to values-based leadership, people are really questioning where they're working, why, if they're going to give their time, is it fulfilling them and making a difference? And this is not just the younger generation. I think all of us are in some sense feeling that way. So for my organizations, or at least the clients that I partner with, they are recognizing they want to set themselves up for the next generation. And the gap that I found when I started Bettman Consulting Group was a lot of them jump into strategy and maybe don't do the mindset work to figure why bother even doing this? Because it is my belief, and this might be counter to some, that if you don't believe in this, don't do it. And so there are organizations that I would not call inclusive, and they're very clear about it, and they won't get my money. I sure won't recommend anyone to work there. And being in integrity, I think, needs to start first. Why do this? Because it's hard work. It's hard work. And there hasn't been a lot of space for that in organizations, I believe. And so that's a lot of what we do. How do you shift those minds and hearts so that leaders can listen differently, can take feedback differently, and can move forward in such a way that's meaningful to all their employees and not just meaningful for the group that's in the room.
Yeah. So, something that I see at times are executive level leaders who have a value for something like diversity or improving communication or improving well being or whatever it is. And they look at the organization and they see the problem as being down there, like at the lower level. And they're lovely people, well intentioned, but somehow they're not making a connection between what's happening at their lower level employee, I guess, zone and what they are doing or how they're interacting with their own team. Can you just speak to that discrepancy, that challenge?
Yeah, it's a couple things. One, we don't know what we don't know. So if we haven't experienced it, we can't possibly know. So if you've never experienced poverty, if you've never experienced wondering where your meal's going to come from, if you've never experienced being a frontline hourly person, if you've had means throughout your life and never had any security issues, all these things, you can't know what you can't see, right? Or you can't see what you don't know. So that's one. But two, I think senior leaders have forgotten what it's like to be at that front line. And so we saw this in COVID. A lot of senior leaders took off to their houses, wherever their houses were, in their different places. Well, the early career professionals were sitting in their apartments, and these are the ones who work from home. The executives went home, while in healthcare, the front line was on the front line. Now, I know that's not true, and I don't want to paint a picture that executives are awful, because that's not at all what I'm saying. Just consciously, no judgment, they're disconnected from the issues. So on the front line, someone may be fearing because get paid $30 an hour. If they miss a shift, that's a good chunk of money, and that can be the difference between rent and food. So when making a sacrifice, am I sick and do I go to work? Do I take risks that others don't need to take? It's a very different perspective. And so part of that mindset shift is telling leaders and reminding them just because it doesn't happen to you doesn't mean it's true. And the most powerful leaders are the ones to say, oh, crap, okay, that's happening to you. That's not okay. They can think through the ramifications and implications. And here's the funny thing in healthcare, people do this all the time because they understand that this symptom, the ramifications could be something really huge, but they don't apply it maybe in their management and leadership.
Yeah, I think it can be hard to kind of think at all those levels. Though I have to say, one example that came to mind while you were speaking was an executive team who was leading a facility I worked at in early COVID. And I have to say, they actually must have been thinking about these things because when they started screening staff for COVID symptoms, it actually was the executive team doing the screening at the front door every morning. And it was quite remarkable. And they didn't need to be, I'm sure. But I think what they were trying to demonstrate was that we are on the front lines, we are with you, we are present, and you're going to see us more than you ever would in normal times. And it was a really powerful message. And I think it really did effectively boost staff morale.
And and the other side to that, because a lot of executives do that, right? And COVID's extreme, but they show up, and I show up to show I'm here. But there's a whole other side of what are you learning in the process by being there that has implications for your organization going forward. And sometimes that gets missed. So a lot of times people create resource groups or organizations, and the executives show up, I call as figureheads. And they are showing up and it's meaningful, but they aren't digesting and processing what they're seeing and receiving on the other end. Now, I don't think any executive could show up at the screenings in COVID and not personally taken it. And actually, it's my belief, just by showing up, you'll be changed because you can't unlearn what you expect or experience. So if you're at a Pride Parade or a COVID screening, you're going to learn a lot that you didn't know. So I find some leaders have to show up in a way that they're to learn as much, and that's as equally, if not more important than what they're showing and modeling, because employees know the difference. And we all know this. We know the person. We're like, why did you even come? Like, I appreciate your hair, but why'd you even come? Versus, wow, thanks a lot for being here. And I really appreciate you for being here. And that's the piece when I talk, those are the subtle things. It's just a mindset shift for the same
Oh
event.
yeah, I so appreciate that you highlighted that. Can you share how you work with leaders to kind of take that step back, to take in what they're learning, what they're being exposed to, and to apply it in that deeper heart-centered way?
Yeah, it's a couple ways. One, I use my privilege of whiteness and a woman who's worked in male spaces to get in the room and plant seed. Did you know? Have you thought about what it's like? If you hear this in the news, what might that mean for your employees? So a lot of it is connecting the dots and considering the implications. And have you thought about if you show up as figurehead and the impact it will have? Very early when I built a DEI program for a Fortune 500, and I was talking to the CEO during the Me Too movement, and he was tempted to say, you know, speak up. We know right from wrong, and we don't want any of you suffering. We want you women to speak up, to a group of 70 women for the leadership program we had going. I didn't know him well. I was new in role, and I had to say, please, I beg of you not to say that. We haven't been able to talk about power and privilege, but I promise you the intention. I see where your intention is. He wants people to be safe. He can't stand that there are women in his organization not feeling stoked to be there, but it wouldn't have had the impact he intended. And so we had those conversations. I do it with teams mostly, start with teams, but I also do individual coaching to talk through this and to help them start to see you have an intention. I see where you're going, but it's not going to land how you think that's going to land. And let's talk about what is it you want to accomplish and match those two as much as possible. And so that's where the values come in. Are you living authentically with your values? The companies that are non-inclusive are still very much living their values. They're very much in integrity, and they're consistent because it's coming from that consistent alignment between the values of the person and the organization.
Yeah. I think sometimes it can be easy, and I speak for myself too. Like it can be easy to think that we're living or I am living it consistently with my values and then my actions don't demonstrate that. And for me, I think I try to be aware of that but I can still miss that. And I'm sure that's the case for other people as well. And I think one of the values challenges that we have in healthcare is this, desire to have and create safety or psychological safety, which, promotes patient safety as well. And obviously that's a very high value and we should be working towards that. But the challenge that I see is that there's a major disconnect between, I think, the intention, like you were mentioning, and how it's implemented. Or, at times, I think it can be difficult for executive teams who don't have a trusting, safe relationship with their own underlings to try to promote psychological safety in an authentic or integrous way. And I mean, how do you help people resolve that kind of tension?
Oh my God, that's such a great question with so many layers. I'll warn you now, if I go all over the place, just rein me
I
back
love
in.
it.
So the first piece is I think our definition of safety is very different, right? I love using kids and relationships as examples. So we think we're providing psychological safety for our kids by checking in with them all the time, doing this, where you go, you ping me, my niece and nephew have watches that now we can see their location. At what expense? Are they learning the safety to be out in the world, right? So our intention is we are doing safety versus we're not actually creating the outcome, which requires the kids to learn and do things. So that's one piece, right? The next is how we receive feedback. And so I like to use the analogy, you and your significant other have been dating for a bit. Your significant other brings you flowers every day. You can't stand flowers. It's bad for the environment. It makes you sneeze, and you're in this crux moment, and women tend to hold this, men maybe less so, but it's like, how do I tell you I don't want flowers? Like, I get what you're trying to do, your love language, and you saw your dad or others in healthy relationship bring flowers, but in our version of healthy relationship, I hate flowers and I don't want you to bring them to me. I'd actually rather you do the dishes, right? And those conversations are hard. And how do we receive that feedback as the gift of, oh, thank God, I hate buying flowers. I hate doing that pit stop. And I was doing it because I learned it because it's good. And so the intention there was to create connection. So that's beautiful and wonderful. But we never talked about, how do I need connection? And that's the same thing that needs to happen in the workplace, and start to really think through it. I'll give you an example. We're in the holidays right now, and everyone's, debate Happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa. What is it? But I just saw a company put out their Happy Holidays picture, and there was nothing with Hanukkah related. Everything was still very Christmas related, even though they had gone so far as Happy Holidays. The intention was to be inclusive, but the behaviors in the party was still very Christmas centric and not religious, but not honoring those sorts of things. So when I say this is complicated, there is safety. And then I'll say the third point is that what we define it differently, I mentioned, but this is the other third point. What's appropriate for the place and for what needs to get done. So you know this, I used to be a paramedic. The amount of psychological safety needed to work together, and Patrick Lencioni talks about this in Trust, is a different kind of safety and trust than I would want with my significant other or best friend. What is the safety that's needed in an organization that's incredibly hierarchical and needs safety versus what needs to be on a leadership team? And making sure that that definition of psychological safety aligns with what needs to happen. So now I'm going to go on the way tangent because I'm passionate about this topic as it relates to advancing women and DEI. So are you familiar with the Korean Air studies in US Air?
No.
Done years ago. It is the foundation of a body of work called crew resource management or safety culture in healthcare. And the idea behind it is what they found is in the black box recordings that it was very differential. So, captain, co-captain. And in Korean Air, the culture was also differential. So they found that in some of the cases that the co-captain knew the plane was going to crash. But they said, you might want to look at the gas gauge, or you might want to look at your elevation. Not, holy crap, oh my God, we're going to die. Get your head out of your behind and get this plane up. So what they found is even when death is imminent, the person in the lower power will not speak up. So if we think about healthcare or advancing women in healthcare, that's if surgeon has the power dynamic and the tech doesn't feel safe enough to speak up because of the perceived or just cultural dynamic in healthcare of power dynamics, they're not going to speak up. And when I learned this, it was so powerful because the leader said one day, it said, when a surgeon cuts off the wrong leg, someone in the room knew it was going to happen and didn't feel safe to speak up. And so then the training is how to create speak up culture for the techs and the nurses and all that, when in fact, it's how do you teach the surgeon to reduce the power dynamics so it's safe for that person to speak up and to be, thank you, you said is my bacon, which is kind of what safety culture and crew resource management does. So when we talk about advancing women, it's usually women doing all the work. And the recent McKinsey study not confirmed it, we've known it for a long time, but it was one of the things that was called out. Well, this is why women don't speak up, because in a power dynamic, in a patriarchal industry, and in healthcare, it's really interesting because the pockets of power sit in different places. It gets tricky, right? And so if women are building the advancing women leaders work in a fundamentally male dominator, patriarchal valued organization, they're not going to speak up, right? Until the power dynamic is neutralized. So going to crew resource management, that means not using titles, but using names. That means a certain level of graciousness. And even in the fire service, because as I mentioned, I started there, saying a word that would trigger someone, like that's stupid, that you would never say to a leader, but it's an agreed upon word on the team so that it stops the leader in their tracks to know they're not listening. They're caught up in their own thing to say, look, I'm seeing something you're not seeing. So there's a trigger word to trigger that conversation. Now, that's a way oversimplification of a lot of these fundamentals, but you can start to see when we talk about psychological safety, as with anything when it's humans, it's complicated. And getting really clear about what environment you're trying to create as driven by your values and mission, right? Going back to the organizational, or what life you're trying to create for yourself as driven by your values and personal values and mission. Psychological safety can look different in different places. So I told you I was going to go all over the place. I think I
Well,
did.
I mean, that was a fantastic, I think, kind of thoughtful way to think about psychological safety from a really holistic perspective. And so, what comes up for me and what I've been thinking about recently is how do we change the environment? And I think you were speaking to this to make it easy for people to behave in ways that are safe. And so that includes those surgeons at the top and, people at the lowest levels. And like from a reality-based perspective, I've literally seen those challenges between surgeons and techs and have heard from people on the bottom end of the power spectrum say, This surgeon is described as like the most brilliant man in the world. How could I possibly have said something? But I knew it was wrong. And it is heartbreaking to hear those stories. And they're not uncommon. So thinking about like how do we approach people with higher levels of power to help them create that environmental shift? It's, I mean, especially when they are probably getting something out of the current power dynamic or structure.
So I think the fundamental belief is that we can't fix what we can't see. So I think as early as medical school, not to mention kind of the macro level power and privilege dynamics that can happen, say with a male surgeon, is kind of no judgment. Somewhere along they were taught that they have to stand this way, do this way, be the smartest in the room, because that's how they create safety for the patients, right? If I got you, you can put your patient, your loved one in my hands and I got you, right? Versus being able to say, because what I do, the fundamental belief for me is I don't believe anyone would want to cut off the wrong leg or make an error. Like none of us would. Even the worst of the worst, whoever you're picturing in your mind, I have to believe, and this is important for me, I have to believe that if they were able to consider information so they wouldn't make the error, they would, right? Unfortunately, our systems are built such that they can't make errors and they have to be perfect and they have to be above best. That's for grant writing, that's for publishing. So if we're talking about physicians, there's that dynamic. So how do we do this? So I worked with a senior leader in radiology, and he and I worked for 6 months because his employees were giving complaints and there were some issues in the department. And I used to work in a large health system on the West Coast, and my job was to increase engagement scores for the team, statistically significant engagement scores, and then on the lowest kind of quartile behaviors that we felt correlated. This health system measured everything. I learned a ton. It was amazing. But, not safe to speak up correlated statistically to a lot of increased workers' comp injuries, increased errors, increased complaints. So anyway, I ended up meeting because they had showed up on an engagement score low. And this senior leader happened to be Asian, and we were having conversations, and he was talking about how he was raised, that he had to be perfect. He had to get to work. And his idea of leading the team was just to get to work and get things done. And I come in and I tell him what we're doing and let's go. When we were talking, I said, walk in and say hi, just see what happens. And he walked in and said, hi, everyone. And that was his homework for 2 weeks. We did 2 weeks between coaching sessions. That next session, he was like, oh my God, I can't believe it. They were much warmer. They were engaged, because part of his complaint is they're not telling me when there are issues. Well, you're not approachable and you freak out when there are issues. So he just started saying hi, and it warmed up the room enough. Now, of course, this didn't magically happen overnight, and I worked with him for about 6 months, but started to build relationship. And one of the things that was most profound is he realized, he goes, I have a son. We were doing our closing session, and he said, I have a son. I think these conversations have changed how I approach him, because I was doing the same with him and he needs more from me. So he was unwinding cultural dynamics in his actual culture, born in culture, but also the cultural dynamics of radiology, cultural dynamics of the hospital system against cultural dynamics that were different, both diverse in race, gender, and also just training and such. And when he started to relax and could be more authentically himself, they started to work more cohesively, and it was a lot better. So it starts again with kind of values and unwinding some of the things, but again, to that, why bother doing this? Because there's some leaders for whom they do get value out of the power, and they can't imagine functioning, and developing emotional intelligence is not their thing. And I would argue, if that person is a risk to the organization, they need to be exited. But a lot of the clients I work with have enough warmth to the topic that they're willing to consider different points of view. And then when you put the team together to start talking to each other and saying what they need, and they learn to hear it, I think you can solve any problem.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I think one thing I've heard from women leaders in particular at times is that they feel pressure to look a certain way, and that perfectionism, I think, really comes in. Because if they don't feel like they're performing, way above 150% of their male peers, They feel like they're vulnerable or at risk of seeing as not a competent leader. And I think for some, I'm sure not all, but for some, that can lead them to like behave in ways that might not be values consistent and that are not very effective in their role.
Yeah. So you and I talked about this earlier. We haven't talked about it on this call. I started my career fire paramedic in healthcare, and I did not want to be feminine. I never wore my hair down. I always carried the bag. I was just I'm tough. You can never accuse me of not being able to do the job. And then I burned out body, mind, and spirit. So after 10 years, I burned out body, mind, and spirit, and that's how I got actually into coaching and such. I was coached in one large health system in California, then I moved into another doing leadership development. But throughout it is always kind of this wellness bent. And what I learned is by shutting off my feminine. And by the way, I'm not fluffy. I got hair and makeup on, but we were joking. This is the first time in weeks I put hair and makeup on, but I did it for you. And I like doing it. But generally, I'm a fairly masculine woman. But I wasn't even letting me do that. And a couple things that come out of it. One, how I showed up with command present leadership was just gross because it was inauthentic. I was trying to do a masculine model of leadership. And there are some who talk about the women's rights movement, and my mom certainly was part of this, where wearing the shoulder pads, wearing a suit. And it wasn't about being authentically feminine and bringing the value and benefits of femininity to a space. It was shifting and twisting and fighting for that seat at the table in a masculine way. And for me personally, it was just gross. I don't resonate with people if I'm showing up trying to be something I'm not. I don't think anyone does. I don't think I have I'm the only one that runs into that. But the thing I underestimated is how draining it is when I can't tap into the wellspring of my authenticity. And I do believe that's what led to my body, mind, and spirit. You take big trucks with lights and sirens, a uniform, a compelling calling and vision, which I think is shared across, even if it's scrubs or a white coat. It's really easy to define yourself with those things and lose sight of who you actually are. And then if you start there, then it's like, who do I need to be as a mom or a parent or a sister or a friend? It can be defined by the community. So for me, I had a rich community. I had no sense of self, so it was being whiplashed all over the place. So going back to your original question, I think women, I can dress up. I love dressing up, and I love being in a trucker hat and flip-flops, right? At no point I'm flexing. I'm flexing into my authentic self in different places. I love command present. I love being a paramedic and walking on the scene and bossing people around. I will not lie, right? I love being with leadership teams that are struggling with really hard stuff, mental, emotional stuff. That taps into my best self, and I can do it and have the energy, and I resonate with the people I'm working with because I'm being totally authentic. That's very different than what I was doing, which was twisting myself or code switching. A lot of women of color describe this, or people of color in generally, or LGBT community, neurodiversity, ability. A lot of people twist so no one knows. No, if I just act this way, no one will know that I'm a woman. Anyone who watching the video will see it's pretty darn clear. But if I'm neurodiverse, if I just twist and fit into the normal behavior, no one will know I have a neurodiversity or ADHD or something. If I twist and don't put pictures up of my family, maybe they won't know that I'm gay and married, a man married to a man with a family. That twisting, think of it twisting your well-being and energy. And I don't believe we show up well and resonate. So I would go back to, it starts with being your authentic self. Be authentic. And then this is the hard question. Does your authentic self fit in the environment? Because the environment requires you to be fundamentally different than who you are. You're in the wrong environment. And that's where that integrity piece of the environment in the company is so important. So that as you feel authentic, you're like, yep, I'm in the right place. This is a place that's stoked to be with me and wants me to be a part of this. I love their mission and vision, and I'm going to give it my all because I love it so much. Versus it's the values of the organization. I loved what I learned here, but I'm going to move on to, say, a teaching organization that actually is more generous in learning in this, or different kite. Some might really like that kind of precision, hardcore environment. So it starts with the authentic self. It starts with the environment. And when those two match, just like in dating, it's great. And it may only match for a few years. It may match for your career. who knows? No judgment. But if everyone is still always looking at this and assessing, are we good together? Are we fulfilling each other's goals? It works. And if the organization decides to, and I'm seeing this with some of my organization, we're going to be more inclusive, and there are people who've been there for years in a male dominated space, like, I'm not interested in that. Cool. We love you, but we're going this way. So technology, health records was probably a huge one that I was a part of, where physicians just said, peace out. I do not want to be in a place that does electronic health record. And it's I love you for what we experienced together, and we wish you the best in your next step. And we're not going to shut down our epic project just to keep you in paper. Right. So anyway, that's another long
Yeah.
answer.
So what are the really practical ways that you help people kind of come home to themselves or take ownership of like their uniqueness in that really beautiful way, learning to fully honor that so they can ask those tough questions and make decisions about whether they fit with the environment and what they want to do next?
Yeah. Yeah, it's very subtle. I work in subtlety and nuance because I think some programs really jump into the meat of it and they're in the middle of the process. The first is listening. What do you love doing? What do you love? What do you do well that no one asks? What makes you stoked? I think kind of employees ask yourself, but I always tell leaders to ask their employees, why do you come to work here? Like, why do you get up in the morning and what keeps you up at night? Right? Those are two really important things. So if what keeps you up at night is the fit thing, and I have to be careful when I use the word fit because sometimes that's rife with bias. But if it's like a misalignment might be a better word, then you have to actually look at it and see where's the misalignment. Is it me not being authentic to myself, or is this a mismatch with the organization? So first it starts like, when do you feel good? When are you happy? Like, what are the things you love doing? What would you do if you never had to get paid? All those wonderful coaching questions and dreamy questions. Sometimes it's as subtle as a friend of mine, fellow coaching colleague of mine says, she recommends that people walk around with a piece of paper and in their day, I love this, hated that, love this, hated that, and start looking at it. So there's a lot of different activities. And what I find is the micro, small, thought provoking activities lead to observation and being able to say, oh, okay, this is where I'm going. And it's not a retreat where they all of a sudden wake up and know who they are. It's these very subtle moments. And whether it's an individual trying to identify with their authentic self, a team trying to identify who they are. And I use the kind of organizational in our house. How do we do this in our house? Or if it's a large organization, it's not a big grand gesture, big community, a big event, a big communication event or anything. It is this subtle looking like, yeah, that works. Nope, not that. Yep, more of that. Nope, not that. And most importantly, no judgment. No judgment and ability to say, we're on a process, we're growing, I'm learning, because I'm still trying to figure it out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bringing what we love into what we do and creating alignment there. I know for me, that's been one of the most powerful things in my own career that has helped me move past burnout. And I'm hoping stay way more sustainable than I was in my first 10
Yeah.
years. I guess there's so many directions we could go in this moment, but one question that I have is how do you equip leaders to equip their people at the bottom of the hierarchy to do some of these same things. And maybe what I'm thinking about is that I wonder if that can feel threatening, or maybe they just never even think about it. But, I think one thing I've seen is that it can be easy to feel like, well, LPNs or schedulers or environmental housekeeping services staff, they're just kind of filling a role and they're going to turn over. And
Hmm.
therefore, we don't need to create this rich developmental experience for them because that's not relevant for them. So, how do we take these big picture things and remember that it is incredibly relevant for people in those roles as well?
Yeah, and I loved I think it was your last podcast or something about the woman who was at the front desk. Or I don't know if she was, but she was talking about that complexity of trying to manage front facing and all the agendas and goals in the organization. So I think it's really important that we remember the capacity for leadership is throughout your organization and the brilliance is in your organization. So the same way that someone in the OR knew that the physician was going to cut off a leg. Someone is solving the problems that you're trying to figure out. So I'll give you an example. So at this large healthcare system, we started rolling out business performance reviews. And it was basically a scorecard where managers would talk about what they're doing well, what they're not doing well, customer service, obviously, quality. These I think are pretty consistent across healthcare organizations. And one of the parts of the business that did best, but is always overlooked, was environmental services. They had the best customer service and they made the most progress in the projects that they did to improve the well-being of their patients. Now, why? Well, one, we all know, I assume we all know, but maybe you haven't had a loved one. The flowers go to the environmental services. Why? Why do families leave the flowers for the environmental service? Because that person is in the room consistently, usually at least if it's a multi-week stay. I've unfortunately had the experience of having a family in multi-week stays. At least you get the same person most times, if not every time, right? And they're in the room, they're cleaning. So that patient is talking to them. And that person cleaning the room is listening. They hear the problems, the concerns. They have the brilliance of what are the things bugging the patient. But we don't ask them. We don't ask them, right? This group did. So that was one. So things like making sure food was warm, making sure someone has a paper. So now my mom, unfortunately, was recently overnight in the hospital. I'm like, holy crap, this is dreamy because she can order food now. She can watch movies. Like her experience is so much different. And I'd like to think, yes, there's researchers who are trying to figure out what the experience is, but really the person cleaning the room probably heard a lot of that and could have rolled their eyes and like, duh, if they didn't actually come up with the idea. But here's the second thing. In our hospital system, we were in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the population was predominantly Hispanic. They had chauffeur businesses, they had bodegas, they had house cleans. They had more business acumen than some of the business people in the organization because their family had run businesses. They were entrepreneurial. So when it came to marrying the experience of the patients to business, they kicked it out. They hit it out of the park. It was amazing, right? So going back to listening, now I will warn you, if a senior leader listens and goes, this is awesome, I'm going to do this, and they've never done it before, and we go back to psychological safety, it's going to be a bit jarring, right? You have to earn your way in the conversation. It's like, I really believe it. And that's a lot of the work I do. How to create the environmental make the environment safe enough to have these discussions, whether it's through a large facilitated event such as a World Cafe, small team, or we create culture councils or inclusion councils with the idea of let's bring those two groups together in a smaller format to learn how to talk to each other and listen to each other. When they've learned it, they become advocates and allies and go in the business, and you either get new groups and subcommittees with more people. But when you have a groundswell of that relationship, I believe, I've said it a couple times, you can solve every problem. Last but not least, because I can't not say this, it's modeling the behaviors. Modeling vulnerability, being able to say, I don't have the answer and I'm looking to you for the answer. And kind of breaking away leader as know-it-all, physician know-it-all, chief of know-it-all, whatever the role is, like I'm here to save you, so I've got to put on this idea, maybe patient-facing, there's a lot of truth to that, right? I don't want to diminish that. But on the backside, hey team, we've got a project. We're going to do this together. You are my eyes and ears. I don't know it all. And we're going to work together to make sure whatever our outcome is incredibly and wonderful. When you model that behavior and someone says something like, I hadn't thought about that. I don't know if we're going to do it, but I'm really going to think about that because that's important if that's really happening. Learning how to process information from people that you don't know or process information from places that you don't get access with grace and generosity and appreciation. It makes the greatest leaders all do this. I'm not saying anything new. That's what they do. They're vulnerable, they're humble, and they recognize it's their team and the people in the organization that are going to allow them to be incredibly successful because they're the eyes and ears. So I say it over and over. The brilliance is in your organization. You just have to learn to listen to it and consider it, especially if it's not your experience.
Yeah, I think people at so many different levels who are living those maybe less glamorous lives within healthcare do tend to have the most creative ideas. And I loved hearing what you were sharing because what the image I got was just how fulfilling it would be for those folks when they are fully valued as equal partners in healthcare, which they are. We have to really recognize that. But how beautiful to, to be able to acknowledge their expertise and then help them to like have a bigger role in influencing what is happening in the organization.
And in this fight for talent, that if they get excited and they get involved, hey, I want to become a nurse. I want to become a physician. Okay. You provide a tuition reimbursement for education, maybe even, have a medical school that you can send them. Who knows? But when they're involved, so I work also in other male dominated fields, beer distributorship, outdoor alcohol beverage. And when you recognize those hourly people or those people that in the power dynamic are at the lowest are also your talent pool, they tend to be more diverse. They tend to have diverse not only in kind of the demographic diversities that we talk about, they also have very different experience than, say, a middle class or upper class white upbringing that you could find in some of these areas. And you tap into that and develop, you've got people for life. And I will tell you, millennials used to get knocked because they moved organizations. Well, that's because they want to change the world and have an impact. If they can't do that, they're going to go to organizations. Gen Z wants to be in the same organization, but they still want to have the crazy impact and be able to influence and be able to make a difference. So the organization that realizes that brilliance is also potential future leaders, is also potential future different tracks. You name the tracks that are valuable. Great. And not everyone has to be, because you need the people who are the doers and love their job. But there was a guy at our hospital, like everyone knew his name. You walk by, hey, said hi, and he was the one mopping the floor, right? He was your best customer service ally and probably would stayed in that role most of his career. And if that's what he wanted, great. But honoring him and saying, I see what you're doing there and you're making such a difference to the people and we appreciate you. And that's where that question, why do you come to work here and what keeps you up at night? Well, if putting his grandchildren through college keeps him up tonight, a monetary bonus would be the thing. If not finishing his degree, his high school diploma, then maybe sponsoring a GED. What is it that keeps him up at night? And then recognizing them by providing and helping to shift that. Maybe it's the schedule. I worry I'm working nights now. I'm not sure this old body can handle it. Awesome. How about doing 8-hour shifts so we can sunset those who've been with our hospital or healthcare units instead of for 30 years? Maybe have 5 more years to go. Can they do 4-hour shifts? Can they do part-time? Can they sunset their career with grace and honor and still be the wonderful person that's contributed for the 30 years?
Yeah, I love that that idea also kind of demonstrates a pathway to help the and I guess I'm thinking largely of hospitals because I've worked largely in hospitals, but it really any healthcare organization to better reflect the community. And I think it's typical that people in the lowest levels of power in healthcare are more likely to be from the community and committed to the community where people up above may have more churn and just kind of move around more and not be from there. But figuring out a way to bring that community into the system and then elevate them as core, long-standing members of the system, I think, promotes sustainability within the organization, but also continuity of values between the community and the healthcare organization.
Yeah. So then I think it was one of your first questions. Who do you have to be as a leader to be able to lead that person? If you grew up in middle class, white suburban communities, went to college, had all the means, maybe more means in San Francisco Bay Area where I grew up, there's lots of means, there's lots of money, right? How can you lead someone that maybe didn't go to high school or was homeless at a time or whatever, right? Or maybe is culturally different. And so there's a different accent or language dynamics. Like making sure you're the leader. Well, first, make sure the values of the organization is going to cultivate that, right? Because not every organization is. And then learn what you need to learn so you can be in relationship and understand how exhausting it is to speak English as your second language all day. So create safe spaces to speak your own language or to understand what it means to not get the overtime because your grocery budget depends on it, or understand what it's someone taking public transit. And if the bus comes 15 minutes late consistently, that was one of the healthcare system. And this research realized one of their best employees was consistently late. Well, it's because the bus coming from across the bay in San Francisco can be an hour, hour and a half trek, was just 15 minutes late. They shifted his shift by a half hour. He got 15 minutes to get to work, to relax, have a cup of coffee, made all the difference for him, right? That's an easy shift. And in a union environment, which this was, the union supported it because it was aligned with creating a great experience for the employees. So sometimes these things we need to do are not huge initiatives or big things that we communicate. And if you feel like it's something where the second step is to go tell the press or post it on LinkedIn, it's probably not the right thing. It's when it's done and you have the outcome stories to tell, that's when you tell the story because you've made a difference. It's not when you have that intention of doing grandiose things. And we saw this after Black Lives Matter and George Floyd was murdered. So many organizations said, we're going to do amazing things on behalf of Black communities. And it was a bunch of white people who actually doesn't understand the needs of the Black community. And many, I would argue, still don't. And why I started my consultancy is one of the many things. So, that reminder that those values all come together and who you need to be to lead such an organization really comes from your values and why bother doing it, because it does take time. It takes energy. And again, if you're in a long-term relationship, you have kids, it's not easy. There are not many yous. It's not easy to just hang out and develop them. It takes work, time, energy, effort, but it's worthwhile. The commitment's worthwhile.
Yeah. So, do you have any kind of couple tips, final tips that you'd like every leader, particularly women leaders or leaders coming from diverse or marginalized backgrounds, to just keep in mind and maybe to encourage them in this whole process?
Yeah, so grace is a word has come up from number of people, so it might just be in the kind of ecosystem that we're in right now. But this idea of that first instinct and action that may not be the right action, and pause and think about, what is the impact I want? What's the outcome I want? And will this get me there? So we started with grace. Go back to the why bother. Why should I do this? Why should I look in the mirror? And this is the key. This is the thing I lost that's important is the more we do this, what I've found is the more I've learned in team building, emotional intelligence, all the leadership, is the less I know. I've gotten much quieter. I've gotten much more receptive. Even if I have to do my breathing exercises because I hear something that I don't like, sometimes I'll go away and like, wow, they're absolutely right. I hadn't actually thought of it that way. I just heard it in a way that maybe was triggering. Like being able to process and realize you don't know half of you don't know any of what anyone's going through, I think is really important. So that pausing, why bother even engaging this? What's the impact I want? And just remember that humility and being able to say, I don't know what I don't know. And that brilliance is in my organization, in my family, in my friends, on the internet, wherever, so that we can stay open to learning about experiences, especially if they're different than ours, are really key. And then the more tactical, get a coach, get someone that can reflect back to you, facilitate experiences and conversations. That's why I love coaching, because it's like you got yourself in this situation. How do you want to get out? And it's really owned by you, the organization, and such. And this is a great place. A therapist, mental health. I was speaking to the choir here, right? Don't do this alone. Talk to your family, negotiate with friends and family about the things you want and need, and just continue learning.
Thank you.
Rarely it's the big efforts as we're approaching the new year. Rarely is it the big efforts and signing up for the gym that's going to work. And the question, actually, I'll leave this. The question I asked is, if we were meeting a year from now and you were totally stoked, you had the most amazing year, what would you be telling me about? And that becomes kind of your path. What's the growth spurt you're after? What is the thing you want to accomplish? How do you want to feel? That'll start to inform some of the things you want to look at. And you'll start to be able to see more clearly the dissonance of where you may be somewhat disconnected. And that's as an individual, with your team, in your family, and all the systems that.
Yeah, the power of those really small daily actions. Well, my very last question for you is, what keeps you connected to joy in everyday life and in this work?
Oh, I think the coach approach to me and seeing
Mm.
people get it. because when they get it, what they do is amazing. I couldn't even have planned it. So that's why I don't tell people what to do. I help them see the problem and either get pissed about it or excited. And then where they go from there is amazing. So that lights me up, is that moment like, oh yeah, I hadn't even thought about that. The next, excuse me, I spend a lot of time outside traveling and watching people. And there is a lot of good in the world. And I think we sometimes forget it and don't see it. And so for me, just being able to see that and take it in and remind myself that there is a lot of joy and there's a lot to be grateful for. And there's a lot of ways people are contributing and making a difference. And so I just, especially this time of year when we can get caught up in a lot of things, just getting outside, appreciating a sunrise, appreciating for us snow, appreciating the cold, and being able to have a really great excuse to curl up with a book. I think just letting those things permeate me is really important.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. And it made me think of my morning walk where I saw a coyote this morning, which was kind of fun. So, and just it's so cool to see the bigger reality and to be reminded that as tough as things are, there's always something bigger. Oh,
Yeah, absolutely.
well,
Absolutely.
Sarah, this was such a privilege. Thank you so much for joining me today on Menders.
Thank you so much for having me. I knew it would be great having listened to the other podcast, and it was just a lot of fun. I really appreciate you letting me share my perspectives
Oh,
on the world.
absolutely my honor.
Fantastic. Thank you.